A very warm welcome to the library of Campion Hall on this warm Oxford summer evening. Welcome to those here present in the library, and welcome also to those of you joining us online. This evening, it's my pleasure as Nick Austen, the Master of Campion Hall, to introduce Love, Our Land and Our Neighbour. Can agroecology bring about ecological conversion? This is the first in a new series of conversations, the Integral Ecology Dialogues. And Laudato Si was published 9 years ago in 2015. And these conversations are really a deep dive into what's happening now in the field. How is the field of integral ecology that brings transdisciplinary dialogue together to look at the ecological and social issues together? How is that field developing? And this evening we're celebrating and exploring especially this question of agroecology. Our talk is hosted this evening by Dr Austen Ivereigh, well known to many for his work on and with Pope Francis. Also a fellow of Campion Hall in contemporary church history, and perhaps less well known, also a practitioner of agroecology on his farm in Herefordshire. We're very blessed to have Professor Norman Wirzba from Duke University, a real leader in this field of the theology of agroecology, and two colleagues from Baylor University, Dr Jenny Howell and Dr Matthew Whelan. So I think we're in for a treat this evening for this conversation. I think Austen may hint that our practitioners are practicing what they preach because they're just back from his farm after having digging up potatoes and the such like. So very much looking forward to this conversation this evening. So over to you, Austen.
Thanks very much, Nick. It's great to be with you all. Thank you for coming, and welcome to those joining us online. So this is the first of a series that we hope will happen 3 or 4 times a year of conversations on the topic of and around the concept of integral ecology. And the idea is to build content, to understand the concept and how it can be applied, to build relationships above all. And we've got here tonight church leaders, we've got university scholars, we've got those involved in policy and advocacy, we've got spirituality writers. I mean, we've got here in this room even the beginnings of a fantastic dialogue. And of course, organizationally, we have plenty of people from the British province of the Jesuits here and Campion Hall, as well as the John Ray Initiative and other organizations. So it's great to begin with such a great gathering here. So tonight, that the general umbrella purpose of these dialogues is integral ecology. But tonight what we want to dig into is an aspect of integral ecology, which we're calling integral agroecology, which is, if you like, the agricultural dimension of the whole ecological question. And the frame of tonight's discussion is about conversion, ecological conversion, to which Laudato Si calls us. But of course, the background to this also is the crisis in agriculture, the crisis in the way we produce and indeed consume food, which has been so much the topic of discussion and debate in many, many books, which will be very, very familiar to you. So we want, if you like, to contribute from the perspective of Laudato Si and the Christian theological discussion around this to that broader debate. So we have a particular project. So you're not often going to get 3 people here in this dialogue, but we happen to be all here because we are part of a project called Loving Our Land, which was born about a year ago. And the colleagues involved are here tonight. And we've just come away from my little farm in Herefordshire, where indeed we were discussing Maximus the Confessor and Bruno Latour in the morning, and then in the afternoon digging up potatoes, making the hay, and having also a very, very nice time. So it was great to be together. So what I want you to hear tonight from these great colleagues is something about the project, but also something about some of the theological questions that we think arise from this topic. So I'm going to begin by just digging into, or asking Matthew to dig into, two concepts which I've already mentioned. Two questions, very simple. What is integral ecology, and what is integral agroecology? So Matthew, you're an expert in Catholic social teaching, Laudato Si. I'm turning to you for that first question.
Thank you, Austen. Thank you all for being here. I'm really looking forward to the dialogue between us. As I understand it, integral ecology is a phrase that Pope Francis does not coin, but he develops in his encyclical Laudato Si. And he speaks about it as an ecology capable of remedying the damage we're doing. We talk a lot about ecology, but that ecology hasn't yet developed into a form capable of remedying the damage. And central to integral ecology is the recognition that our lives are rooted in three fundamental and interconnected relationships: with God, with neighbor, and with the land upon which all creatures depend. And so integral agroecology then is our way of thinking about the agricultural implications of that integrated ecology, the whole that integral ecology keeps in mind, but focused on agriculture. It develops a tradition of agroecology that is based in the integration of ecological principles and process into agriculture, but expanded, right? Expanded to include quite explicitly love of neighbor, and in our case, love of God as well. So what does agroecology look like when expanded out in this way? As Austen mentioned, I mean, one of the ways we've been talking about this project is loving our land and neighbor. That's a sort of an encapsulation of what we mean by integral agroecology. And what I'd say is that implicit there is the idea that love has an ecology, right? We can't love our neighbor without caring for all that our neighbor depends upon, that we all depend upon. That is our common home, right? We can't love our neighbor if we're doing profound damage to that to which we all depend upon. So it's a recognition that deep within Christian tradition, there is love is at the heart of it, and there's this ecology to our love.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Now, turning to our project, I'm going to ask Jenny, what is this project about that we've been involved in? What is it trying to do? What is the itch it's seeking to scratch, the gap it's seeking to fill, whatever metaphor you want to use? What's our project doing? Over to Jenny.
Well, I think the precision of our question came out of a visit that Matthew and I had an opportunity to take a couple years ago now to the Human Rights Commission in Geneva. And while we were there, we had a very good meeting with the Office of Right to Food. So right to food is a claim of the UN that says that not only do humans have it's more sophisticated than food insecurity, shall we say, right? It's not just a question of how do we put food into the mouths of the hungry, but how do we make life possible so that everyone has access to grow their own food and have lives that are flourishing. So questions that we might examine in that space might be right to not migrate. We're concerned about issues of women's health, children's education. All of these things are at play. And they're at play in agroecology, right? These are measures of a successful agro-ecological endeavor. So while we were there, we were having a conversation. We were hearing about different initiatives around the world, and it became obvious in our discourse that they weren't paying attention to what the church was doing about these issues. In fact, they said to us explicitly, "We have no idea what the church, specifically in our context, the United States, is doing around issues around food sovereignty. Will you help us?" And this is a significant moment, let's say, first for the UN to acknowledge this space, which is oftentimes overlooked. This enlivened our imagination. And as is the case that Matthew's making, love is a web. This project is formed by a web of friendship and connection. We're all passionate about these issues. we're all working on these issues. And so we began to meet together, and we realized that the grammar and the language that Pope Francis gives us in Laudato Si, specifically the claim that he makes that the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor is the same cry. This is something that we collectively need to reflect on. And it's not something that we're inventing and trying to just impose on the church. We're deeply convicted that the church is already doing this. And it's our job, or it's an invitation that we have to begin to map where the church is doing this work, to record it, to listen, to learn from these initiatives. Again, Pope Francis says, this work is already at hand. The Holy Spirit is like a mist rising up from underneath the door. It's fragile, it's gentle. And so we want to pay attention to that mist and see what we can learn. It's not just a Catholic endeavor. I'm Baptist, I'm very Baptist. But Pope Francis says this is a call not just to Catholics. He gives us this grammar, and thus a way of imagining how we can see God's work unfold in the world.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Now, Norman, so Matthew's Catholic, Jenny's Baptist. I'm not sure. You're kind of post-denominational, I think.
I'm kind of a mutt.
Yeah, kind of. But one thing, of course, that we all know about you if we read your books is that you grew up in Canada as a farmer. You then became a theologian, and you discovered that there was a big gap in theology. Can you just tell us what that gap is that we're seeking to mind in this project?
Sure. So, yes, growing up on a farm, I always understood that the way I think about the world is so different than the way my city friends did. And I didn't register that very much. I just knew that there was this big gap between how we think and how we act, too, because our desires and our responsibilities were just so different. So then I go to Yale Divinity School to study theology, and there was no farmer on any syllabus. Then I went to do a PhD in philosophy. Again, not a single farmer on a syllabus. And I thought, this is a bit strange, because for 10,000 years, this is what the vast majority of human beings have done with their day-to-day lives. They've grown food, they've taken care of land, they've taken care of animals. And to think that none of these folks and their perspective, their practices informed their thinking, none of that was represented in a syllabus. And so I took a Doctrine of Creation course, fabulous professor, and all of the questions never touched the ground. They were all about the metaphysics of creation, right? How do we bring in Origen and Plato and Plotinus to see, and those are valuable pursuits. But for me, the question, well, where is the land? Where are animals in this doctrine of creation? And this has been, a source of concern to me for some time, because it's not just that in a divinity school, a very fine divinity school, farming didn't show up. It's also my perception that for a lot of people in congregational life, farming doesn't show up as a theological or a spiritual endeavor. And this is so important, because what I do now is I spend a lot of my time trying to re-articulate a doctrine of creation in which land, plants, animals, sweat, blood, death, they show up. Because one of the most important things about agricultural life is this is the testing of our thinking. And so the abstractions that we can do as philosophers and theologians, especially when they are almost exclusively driven by urban-type concerns, yield a picture of the world and our place within it, which is strikingly different than the way agricultural people might think about.
And to know more, Norman's recent book is called Agrarian Spirit, but you can get this from any of his books, and it's a wonderful discovery in a way to realize that there is this awakening theologically, which you're at the forefront of. Thank you. Now, Jenny, you are, as you said, a Baptist. You're also married to a Baptist minister who's here with us tonight in Waco, in Central Texas. You are teaching about the theology of creation while helping to run this big church. You're passionate about connecting theological education with a love of place and food. Very concrete question. What can the churches learn from your experience there in Waco in bringing these two things together? What have you discovered as a church, as a congregation?
Well, I can speak congregationally. I can also speak on part of the seminary. I teach my classes on a farm. It's a 40-acre farm just a few miles north of the campus, and It's in that space that I sit with seminary students and think together about the doctrine of creation. In an evangelical context, I would make the argument that most of my students coming in are Gnostic. They don't know how to think about creation. That the story of salvation is a story where we ask Jesus into our heart, and that someday we will be with Jesus and he will take us away from the cares of this world. And so my work is to reintegrate the Christian life to the land that we are made of. And what I have learned in doing this is that most of my students, when they begin to get it, when they have this kind of conversion, a conversion of how they see the world, they find more of themselves. They already love their backyards or their homes, or they already love going to the Grand Canyon or walking in a forest. But now that they understand this is actually part of what it means to be human, it's not something to compartmentalize, and that God is inviting us into this work, it's joyful. Then we begin to understand the reality of our climate and of our age, and then we begin to despair. And so this is, I think, an important moment for the church, both to learn to see the joy and the beauty and the goodness of creation, and also to understand the moment that we are in, and that this failure that we have as humans isn't simply a scientific failure, it's not a technological failure, it's a theological and moral failure. And the church has something to say and to do in a way of being that is so important for this time.
Thank you. So Matthew, you're Assistant Professor of Moral Theology at Baylor, and your research has been above all centered on Catholic social teaching, Latin American and liberation theologies. You've done some great work on Central America, Blood in the Fields, your book about land reform in El Salvador, and Oscar Romero, and so on. Where do you see Laudato Si as opening up a new horizon in Catholic social teaching?
That's a great question. I think the way Laudato Si opens up a new horizon is calling the Catholic Church and Catholic social teaching towards an ecological conversion, plain and simple. Catholic social teaching as a tradition that reflects upon social life in light of the faith has for a long time been very good at discerning the cry of the poor. I think of the founding document of Catholic social teaching, at least modern Catholic social teaching, Rerum Novarum, and it begins with the cry of the poor. Cry of the poor is profoundly audible and has continued to be audible over the course of the Catholic social teaching tradition, right? What has not been as audible is the cry of the earth, the way social life impinges upon, depends upon, and relates to sort of creaturely life, the wider created order more generally, the damage that's been done, the consequences of that damage. It's been much, much, much less adept at perceiving the cry of the poor, and it's the cry of the earth. And it is really, I think, Laudato Si that calls our attention to that helps us hear it and discern it and respond to it. And I think that's the other thing I'd say is that is important to know is that has always been the case, right? The patron saint of integral ecology for Pope Francis is Saint Francis, who does hear the voice of the earth, who does hear the voice of the poor, right? So there always have been these examples across Christian history that do attune us to those things. Rutilio Grande, Oscar Romero are another really good examples. You've alluded to my book, Blood in the Fields. But it's really in Laudato Si that those twin cries are crystallized and articulated in a very explicit kind of way.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. Norman is, I suppose, can I call you a disciple of Wendell Berry? You were certainly very influenced by Wendell Berry. And in this book, which I've already mentioned, Agrarian Spirit, you write that Jesus was an agrarian and that we are all called to be agrarians, not in the sense that we're all called to be farmers, obviously, but to act on the truth that Laudato Si calls us to know ourselves as created beings and landed beings. Can you say more? How are we called to be agrarian? How is the church called to be agrarian?
Yeah. So I want to actually build on what Matthew and Jenny just said, because I think it's so important and brilliant. So one of the things that agricultural traditions help you appreciate is precisely your finitude, your mortality, your enfleshed condition, which automatically ties you to the flesh of the world, the flesh of plants, the flesh of other animals, the flesh of microorganisms. And this just disappears in the broad theological traditions, especially, I would say, of more modern ways of speaking. Scripture is an agrarian book. And sometimes I say that to colleagues and they say, what are you talking about? And it's lost on them that we're living in a time which is unprecedented in the history of the world, in which almost no people have any direct relationship, practical engagement with landed realities. So they're blind to them. And so when they read Scripture, they think it's a story about God taking people to heaven. When if you actually read the Bible with a little bit of openness to the presence of land, plants, and animals, it's everywhere. Right? So what we're trying to do is actually recall people to themselves, to their own embodied condition. And I think agriculture does that beautifully, because agrarian principles are founded on practices that take your hands and your feet, your full sensorium, into a world where you meet the lives of plants, where you meet insects, where you meet sickness, where you meet death, the smell of compost, right? These are all realities. And theologically, I think what's so important to do is to help understand that God is present in those realities. Right? I think one of the most damaging things that theologians are still dealing with is that they're Gnostic, right? Or they're dualist, but they're also deist. The doctrine of creation matters primarily because God got it going a long time ago, and God is absent, God is distant, and mostly mad. Right? And what we're trying to say instead is, no, if you actually pay attention to the way Scripture speaks, God is in covenant relationship with all creatures from the beginning, because in creatures, in land, in bodies, that's where the love of God is at work. And that's why God becomes incarnate in this world, so as to show the full realization of what a godly way of being in flesh looks like. Because the image that we end up with, of course, is not humans escaping the earth, it's God coming to be with mortals forever.
Thank you. And of course, one of the things that we've looked at in this project, and we are looking at very concretely, is how the churches themselves relate to their own land. The church, of course, is a major landholder, but mostly land is, mown, a parking lot, something that a monastery might have and perhaps give to an estate manager to manage, but they are detached from it. And there's an abandonment there of the church's own kind of tradition. So I'm going to just move into the last part of this by asking a very general question to all three of you, which I think we're now going to talk about the climate crisis. I know you're surprised that we haven't mentioned it before now, but of course we are responding. All this takes place against the backdrop of the climate crisis. And you, all three of you, are engaged in teaching young people. And the people of this generation are said to be the most anxious ever. There was Hannah Ritchie's book, some of you may have seen, Not the End of the World, begins with citing a global survey showing that 3/4 of 16 to 25-year-olds see the future as frightening, and half believe that humanity is essentially doomed. A whole lot of them are reluctant to have children for that reason. We have young people here tonight, they can speak to this maybe in the Q&A. How do you respond to that sense of doom and anxiety in young people, which is another way of asking, where is the hope? Any of you? Feel free.
Well, I'll start. It's an incredibly important question, because when I teach a course on climate change at Duke University, mental health issues are foremost in our mind in how we think about structuring the course. Mm-hmm. Because for people who may have thought, well, climate change reality affects other parts of the world, or it's coming 30 years down the road, that's just not true. We have a very international student body, so students are sitting next to people whose homes have just been flooded, right? So they understand that this is real, and I think what's very clear to me is that they are deeply suspicious of any talk about hope. Mm-hmm. Because especially people like me, 60-year-old white man, have done so much damage to the world. And it's just ludicrous for me to say, hey, have hope. Or we have hope in you that you will fix the problems that we created, right? That's just ridiculous. So the question then is, how do you listen to their deep suspicions and honor those suspicions, because they are so sick of any techno version, right? Elon Musk is going to save us, or any religious version. God's got this. God's in control. None of those work, and they shouldn't. They shouldn't be accepted. So then the question becomes, what might hope look like? And what I tend to do is I try to switch the frame, not to what do you hope for, or what gives you hope, or do you have hope, but what do you love? Because I think love is the operative question at this moment. Because if we can find things, places, people, communities that we are prepared to love, we will start to do the work to nurture and protect those places, those people, those communities. And in doing that work, we know a lot of bad is coming, but we still have an opportunity to create goodness and beauty in the world, which is itself an inspiration for people to join in that effort. Because we don't know how it's going to turn out, but we at least have the responsibility to inspire in each other a love for what is here.
And we're presumably confident that those actions which might not appear to be particularly effective or successful in our local area or even in our lifetimes, because they are aligned with the kingdom,
Right. Yeah, it's always the small things that make the difference, right? I know students at Duke, they're big thinkers, they want to solve the world's problems, and they want that silver bullet solution. And we say, no bullets, just buckshot. And it's still a rather aggressive metaphor, I know, but still, it's the idea that it's all the small actions that you don't know where they're going to end.
So maybe can you just mention a few of those concrete actions that the churches are taking that would express that hope?
First, let me just say that Norman has a book on hope coming out in a few months.
He does.
So that was very lovely.
Thank you.
And very well reflected on. I think that right there, that question, Austen, is part of this project. We want to understand what the church is already doing, not only just so that we, become experts in this or something in the academy, but because we want the church to understand what she's already doing, and that in and of itself can be a site of hope. And to Norman's point, it's not going to be one thing that solves this. False forms of hope are some of the greatest, it takes away from genuine hope.
But Jenny, concretely, what kinds of things? Because you've got them going on in your church.
Right. So at our church in Waco, we have a composting site where one of the city's compost drop-offs. And part of the formation of our children in our church is we've given the families in our church little buckets. And every week, the families can bring their food scraps to the church where it's composted. And then church members can then in turn come and take that compost back to their gardens at home. And the children have they learn how to compost. They get excited about giving their trash to the church and seeing something good come from it. And they theologically reflect on this. Right? Our kids are saying things like, look at what God does with this banana peel. God can do that with people too. No one is trash. Nothing is trash in God's economy. And so we begin to see not only the practical, we have these competitions at the church of how many pounds of trash can we sequester from our landfill, but we see the spiritual formation and the way of seeing the world that's coming from those kinds of practices. That's one example.
Thanks. Matt, any others?
Yeah, there's many examples, right? When I did a degree in tropical agroecology over 20 years ago, and that was an extraordinarily marginal discourse within the agricultural sciences at the time. And the shift that we've seen over the course of the last 20 or so years, where the UN, various sort of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, like now agroecology and working with the land ecological processes to produce our food, this is now centered in a way that it wasn't before. So, and within the church, there's so many examples in the United States. We see, in Waco, numerous examples along the Eastern Seaboard, the Black Food Security Alliance, right? in the midst of the pandemic, they decided, why are we maintaining all these lawns? We're going to tear up our lawns in order to plant gardens to feed our communities. And now they're organizing with Black farmers all along the eastern seaboard. Emmanuel Katongole, a dear friend of many of us, right? He started the Bethany Land Institute in Uganda. All over the place, across denominations, these things are happening. And really, that brings me hope. And when I work with students, my task in the face of their despair, which drives them into themselves, that drives them towards inaction, is really to say, but look out at the world. Look at all these things. Find a place that you can be connected and get your hands dirty.
Well, thank you, all three of you, very, very much indeed for those really insightful remarks. Now, over to you. In this room, we have tremendous expertise, so please feel free to speak up, ask a question, share a reflection. We've also got people online. Tim's registering the questions. I've been told that if you raise your hand, I'm to go to you, because that will be somebody online. So would everybody like to kick off with a question or reflection? Please say who you are, perhaps at the beginning, briefly. Please.
Hi,
Just wait for the microphone. There we go.
Hello. My name's Anna and I work for Hope for Creation, and I'm sorry to be one of those stereotypical despairing young people.
Go for it.
But with my question, what you were saying towards the end sort of touched on a question for me that feels very urgent, and a lot of the examples that have been given have been examples, I think, rooted in the concept of justice, which, not to be too political, but tends to be a sort of more leftist interpretation of Christianity. Right. So how does that sort of sense of responsibility and justice kind of translate not just across denominations, but also across political divides?
It's a great question. We've been thinking about this because one of the things apparently in the US with many of the churches, if you go in saying you're concerned about climate change, they shut down immediately because that's all a global conspiracy. Just before I invite the panel to answer, what is Hope for Creation? Can you just tell us briefly what that is?
Oh, thank you. So Norman's heard of us, but so we are a very new interfaith environmental project that looks at basically the sort of philosophy as hope is a doing word. So touching on the actions that you were emphasising earlier. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Super. So how do we speak to people who are allergic to left-wing language of justice?
Okay, well, how about the seminary professor in Central Texas take this answer? I was telling Austin the other night, it's like, if we can do this in Central Texas, we can do this anywhere, right? And the answer is you do it carefully. I think that the language of climate change is political, and immediately there are people who cannot hear the discourse if you use that language. And so you don't. You don't have to use that language. You can get there. But first you start with, what does Scripture say about us? Well, how are we called to love the land? And again, back to Norman's point, it's about what we love. And you can talk with, ranchers in West Texas about what they love, and they can tell you that they're seeing their cattle suffer. They can tell you that they're watching the changes, and you can have a conversation. You just have to stay away from some of the language, and then it's an improvisation. You're constantly adapting, right? But they want to talk about it. And so finding those ways to talk, I think, is this one of the most hopeful places, is that we are talking about it in Texas.
Thank you.
I would just add briefly to respect the agency of the people you're talking with, to invite them into the work. I think sometimes what happens is leftist, progressive, do-gooder types come in with the solutions, and the assumption then is that the locals who were there, they were stupid, they didn't know how to do it all along, and in fact, that's just not true. So to find out what would you do to address this or that issue, because you've got wisdom, bring it. Let's engage with you, because we have a lot to learn.
Just on that point real quick, I'll just say, I was on a panel on climate change, and someone who was very skeptical sort of wrote me immediately afterwards and was pestering me with all these sort of stats and things that he felt was not taken into consideration. And I listened to him, and I talked to him, and we went out to coffee. And what he said to me was, people don't listen to me, so I'm really glad that you did that. And I think just humanizing, dignifying, and just taking seriously people's questions is really crucial.
That's right.
Thank you. Next question or comment, please.
What an amazing panel we've got this evening.
Just say who you are if you don't.
I'm Olivia Graham. I'm the Bishop of Reading, Diocese of Oxford. I've just been reflecting as you've been thinking about the amazing conversation which you're having across Christian denominations here, and in discovering amongst yourselves the key points of connection and language with which you can communicate with each other and therefore out to the constituencies which you represent. I'm interested to know whether you have had a sort of similar dialogue or thought about how we do that in an interfaith context. I first met Norman at the Glasgow COP 3-4 years ago, and I was doing a lot of work there with the interfaith leaders, and we were discovering a common language, which is held by all our scriptures. I mean, every single sacred text that we looked at, we would find this care for the earth in it. But I just wondered how you're developing those ideas with that sort of wider constituency in mind.
You're the lead bishop, aren't you, in the Church of England on environmental questions? Have I got that right?
I'm one of three.
One of three,
in the Church of England, but I lead for the Diocese of Oxford locally on those issues.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, so lovely question, Olivia. I think one of the most exciting things I've been able to do is the last 2 years, Abdullah Antepli, who's an imam at Duke, he and I have convened a group of young faith leaders from around the world, every continent, and we have the most marvelous time. You know, Jews, Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, indigenous, all sorts of people come. And by the end of the week, everybody is hugging and crying because they're going to have to say goodbye to each other. Because what ignites all of these young faith leaders is their love for neighbor and their love for their places. And they're seeing both terribly wounded. And we don't have to spend hardly any time at all saying, what does your tradition have to bring to this conversation? We all know that our traditions bring so much. So we don't fight about hermeneutical issues. We don't fight about preaching styles. We don't fight about canon law, any of that kind of stuff. We're immediately focused. How are we going to address extreme heat? How are we going to address food insecurity? How are we going to address migration? We get practical. And we see that what we need most is the friendship of each other, because it's often lonely work. And so I think the space, as you say, is enormous for this interfaith work, because there's a lot of issues where there can be a lot of fighting about, but taking care of neighbors and taking care of our land, that's not one of them. It's very hopeful, yeah.
And the other thing, Norman, you talk about a lot is starting from food.
Oh yeah, food is the best prison.
Which brings us all together.
It's a delicious prison.
Rather than starting, Tim.
So we've got many questions online about politics, about liberation theology, but here's one that might be expansive for you all. And it's picking up the word agrarian, which has been appreciated, but inviting consideration of 2 or 3 other words in relation to theology. And the words are horticultural, pastoral, and gardening. So I'll leave those words to see if you have any thoughts.
Perhaps we'll leave that just to ferment a moment. Have we got another question or comment? Please.
Thanks, panelists. I've really enjoyed this, and
Natalie, tell us who you are. Confess your relationship.
I'm Natalie Carnes. I'm a professor at Baylor, and I am married to the panelist in blue. That blue.
That blue.
There's actually 4 panelists in blue right now. The most blue. I really appreciate the question about hope, and I appreciate the way, Norman, you talked about really thinking about the mental health of your students when you talk about this, because I'm sure we've all seen the stories about this in the news, the way that there's like this new genre of depression, which is like climate depression, and it's for people who really stare into the abyss of the litany that surrounds our climate crisis, the litany of destruction and damage. It's hard to go anywhere but despair. And but it seems to me like one of the things that Christianity obviously has a lot of baggage is brought into this climate crisis, and it's been responsible for a lot of the kind of problematic thinking around it. This is, there's been a lot of like flagellation within Christian theology about this, but it seems like Christian theology also has, or Christianity maybe, has things to offer in terms of, well, like one thing that we have done for like centuries and centuries is we've cultivated spiritual practices in order to face the desperate situations and crises of our world. And I wonder if you all have cultivated in your own lives or with your students or in your churches spiritual practices for being able to face the end of the world.
And by the way, just before you answer, one of the texts that we had this week, which Tim Howell's led us in, was Bruno Latour saying, actually, in a way, the church needs to recover something of the apocalyptic discourse of the early church. Of course, we were very familiar in the early church with the idea that the world was coming to an end, and in a way that was evangelically fruitful, if you like. Sorry, just spiritual practices that help us to confront the end of the world or survive it, or defray it.
Well, I'll speak real briefly. I'm a gardener, and gardening in Central Texas is itself a kind of spiritual discipline, right? You know this, you live there with me, and it's really hot, and the weather is becoming, as to borrow from Catherine Hayhoe, it's weirding. It's becoming much less predictable and much more harsh. And in the gardening, I learned several things. I learned that it's not up to me to make things come out right. I learned that in spite of my best efforts, sometimes things will not turn out right. And sometimes in light of my worst mistakes, beauty will come. And so I come to see both the beauty and the fragility of life. And it literally grounds me to keep gardening as I'm doing this work.
And you don't have slugs.
No, I got fire ants. It's worse.
We have a lot of snails.
Yeah, a lot of snails, okay.
Yeah, well, so it's a really great question, Natalie. I mean, I think that recovering traditions of ascesis, right, doing without embracing disciplines, I think so that we can love God, love neighbor better, drawing us deeper into relationship with God and neighbor through going without. I think that this is crucial, but it's also difficult because no one wants to say in an era of immediacy, don't do this, go without this, deny yourself this, right? I just don't think that there's any way we embrace the fullness of the hope to which we're called if we don't sacrifice things in our lives and learn to go without. Do I really need this? Can I do without this? Should I be using single-use plastics, right? Can I not drive? Can I deny this invitation because I'm really beginning to get more concerned about, plane flight? Like all these things in our own lives, learning to go without, learning to say no, it seems to me just indispensable.
I'll just add one thing. I have been, and this is the contrarian in me, I've been somewhat skeptical about a lot of spiritual writing because it seems to me to be very individualistic and also very heroic. And I just don't have a lot of patience for that. It's way too much pressure and it's way too much male, to put it bluntly. I think spiritual practices are ultimately quotidian, and I think they're communal. And one of the things that's so difficult, I think, in our time is the isolation people feel in the context of these mental health issues that you mentioned. And the more we can do to bring people to each other, to be with each other, and to do quotidian tasks together, like building, like repair, like cooking, like gardening, these kinds of things, they're enlivening. And the disaster that I find in so many of the students that I talk with is they are so lonely because they just want to be in the fetal position and hide. And what we know from people who are hopeful people is that they're with other people and they're doing stuff. It's not glamorous stuff often, but even cooking a meal together, it's transformative for people when you're doing it with other people. I mean, we experienced that this week, how much fun it was to eat because we also prepared the food together.
Well, thank Thank you very much indeed for these reflections. I think what you've heard tonight is a little bit of an insight into the kind of thinking that we've begun, just the few of us, but obviously with others. We had a very interesting meeting this afternoon with a person who deals, I won't give details, but deals with the way property is used by the Catholic Church. And she was explaining how in discussions about use of land, of course, increasingly with churches closing, congregations closing down and so on, people want to know, how do we use this land? And of course they have usually a very short list, and it includes building affordable housing, it's health and education, the kind of thing often that religious orders exist from. Very, very rarely does anybody think about how the land could be used in ways that are regenerative, create resilience, create community, how also the church could help to foster a new generation of regenerative farmers, small-scale farmers of the sort that we know are becoming more and more popular. There are very large numbers of young people full of energy, creative people with often great skills, but what they lack is access to land and often the 4 or 5 years that it takes for a new farm to become profitable. So it seems to me there's a whole mission here for the church to be developed. And it requires theological input, it requires theological perfection, it requires also the example of good practices, which is what we're seeking to discover in our mapping exercises.
Yeah, go on. Just make one point, which I think is crucial. You know, this week being at Austen's place is amazing. And I think so many people do not have that because they live in buildings, climate controlled, looking at screens most of the day. But you come to a farm context and you encounter God in the miracle of life that's unfolding for you every day. And so it's not to be underestimated how important it is to get people outside, engaging the realities of plant, animal, soil, weather, life, because people feel part of the trouble they feel, I think, is the absence of meaning, the absence of the loveliness of this life, because we're encountering so much ugliness in our day-to-day experiences. And farm experiences can change that.
That's a great note on which to end. I've been told we have to end by now to give time for us to move next door. So just on your behalf, to give a huge thanks to our 3 panellists, but also thanks to those joining us online, and indeed thanks to you for being here tonight for the first of our Integral Ecology Dialogues. Thank you.
Just if I can add my word of thanks to Norman, to Jenny, to Matthew and to Austen. I think you've shown us what a real down-to-earth theology could look like, this sort of unity between practice and reflection. And it makes theology all the more exciting for that. So many thanks again, giving us a lot of food for thought. No pun intended. And do keep your eye on these Integral Ecology Dialogues on the LSRI website and on the Campion Hall website, and we hope to see you soon. Have a good evening.